wave rising and the dumbest bill in America. This is Mark Fisher with Mark and the Millennials. And the Millennial joining me today, of course, is our producer, Christopher Hopkins. Welcome, Christopher, and welcome everybody to Mark and the Millennials. This podcast is called Red Wave Rising, and that is because in California, of all places, there may be a Republican governor. Will California turn red as a result of the recall election of Gavin Newsom? So, believe it or not, podcast listeners, Kamala Harris has been in hiding, yet in California, they want Kamala Harris to come there and actually campaign for Gavin Newsom, if you can believe that. The same person you can't find anywhere with this Afghanistan crisis and with, of course, the crisis at the border. She's nowhere to be found. She has no opinion on anything, but she's going to show up and campaign for Gavin Newsom. So here's what it says in Politico, obviously a left-leaning magazine to say the least. Kamala Harris to campaign in California for Newsom. Vice President Kamala Harris will hit the California campaign trail to rally Democrats against recalling Governor Gavin Newsom. Harris plans to swing through the San Francisco Bay Area next Friday, according to Newsom's campaign, returning to her political home turf in the vital final weeks of the recall race. Quote, "I am excited to join my friend and our vice president next week," Newsom said in a statement. The stakes of this election couldn't be higher. Yeah, you couldn't say that again. While Newsom has sought to frame the recall campaign as part of a national political struggle, enlisting prominent Democrats like Elizabeth Warren to get out the vote, the Biden administration had largely stayed on the sidelines beyond brief affirmations of support for Newsom. That began to shift last week when President Joe Biden released a lengthy statement rallying Newsom's defense. Now, Harris's intercession will solidify the White House's public backing for Newsom. A visit by Harris could also help rally California Democrats to fill out their ballots, because we know Democrats don't know how to fill out ballots, at least legally, particularly the critical Democratic voting bloc of women of color. While Harris's poll numbers have slipped in recent months, she retains deep support in the San Francisco Bay Area, where she launched her political career as prosecutor. With millions of mail-in ballots now in voters' hands, Newsom's campaign has shifted to a turnout the vote strategy that seeks to galvanize Democrats in the face of soaring Republican enthusiasm. Voters have only a few weeks to fill out and return their ballots through the September 14th election date. That's right around the corner, podcast listeners. September 14th is the election date. And it's a lot more complicated than what you would think, because as they have in Vox magazine, they are explaining to you how you get elected in California in a recall election, which is a little bit different. How California's bizarre recall system could elect a Republican governor. Isn't that funny? Only in Vox. And it's the recall system's fault. Otherwise, you would never have a Republican governor. There's an odd asymmetry in what Governor Newsom needs to do to stay in office versus what his replacement could need to win. So here's what has to happen in California. If you haven't been following California's recall election battle, you might scoff at the idea that Governor Newsom is fighting for his political life and perhaps even to safeguard Democratic control of the U.S. Senate. California is a deep blue state, after all. Could a Republican really win? But the strange design of California's recall system and California's strategy for navigating it make a Republican win more plausible than might be expected. That's one reason the conservative activists who started the recall effort are pushing to remove Newsom from office this year rather than waiting until the 2022 election. They believe they have a better shot at winning now. The first question voters will see on the ballot is this: should Governor Newsom be recalled? Now, let me say this again, podcast listeners. Here's what the ballot says. Should Governor Newsom be recalled? And you have to answer one question, that question first, before you answer the second question. So the first question is, should Governor Newsom be recalled? And you have to answer yes or no. There's no other answer, yes or no. And then there's a second question. If Newsom is recalled, who should be his replacement? Here, voters are presented with 46 candidates, Republicans, Democrats and other, kind of affiliations of, it's California, so it could be any kind of affiliation whatsoever. Probably the Communist Party, the Socialist Party, who knows? The Progressive Party. So the second question is, if Newsom is recalled, who should be his replacement? And you have to choose between 46 candidates, of which Newsom is one. It says here, mail-in voting has already begun, and in-person voting will take place September 14th. So I want to cover this again to make sure we got this right. The second question, if Newsom is recalled, who should be his replacement? Here, voters are presented with 46 candidates, Democrats, Republicans, progressives, socialists, etc., but not Newsom. Mail-in voting has already begun, and in-person voting will take place September 14th. So this is kind of confusing, and I want to speak to this just a little bit. So Newsom will not be on the ballot. The way they have this set up, according to Vox magazine. If you are asking to recall him, then by definition, you are going to vote for one of the other candidates. If you say, no, I don't want to recall him, then by definition, that is a vote for Newsom. So Newsom's name actually isn't on the ballot part of the second question of the 46 candidates. And that's because if you say, well, I don't want to recall him, then by definition, you want to keep him. So therefore, in your perfect world, he would remain governor. It's kind of confusing, but also all that has to happen is what Vox says here. Here's where it gets bizarre. Newsom needs to win a majority of the vote to stay in office. If he fails to get that majority, his replacement can win merely by being the top vote getter in a crowded field. So the top vote getter wins. Two recent polls have shown conservative talk show host, he's a conservative talk radio host, Larry Elder, who's a Republican, who's also black, in first place with 23% of the vote, a small plurality that could still make him governor if Newsom loses the recall question. So let's walk through this. Question number one, should Governor Gavin Newsom be recalled? And if the majority of people who respond to this ballot say yes, then here's what we know. Then the second question is asked, which is, well, if he is recalled, because a majority of people say they want him to be recalled in question number one, then who of the 46 candidates do you want to replace him? And all that has to happen is whoever gets the most votes out of those 46 candidates replaces Newsom. That's probably the best way to explain this. So it's very odd the way California does it. And as you can imagine, podcast listeners, the Democrats in California are very upset over this recall system, because now the same recall system that Democrats put in place in California, a state that has a supermajority in the state Senate and the state assembly and has a Democrat governor, and every active lever of power in California is controlled by Democrats. All of those people put this system in place. Now they're going, well, that's not the system we really wanted. We never put that system in place so a Republican could win. So you really have to understand something. In order for a Republican even to have a chance, the Democrats must really be messing up California. So in the Sacramento Bee, it says, Democrats sped up Gavin Newsom's recall to avoid a California crisis. The crises are happening anyway. And it basically goes on to talk about all of the issues in California. The climbing COVID-19 cases, Governor Gavin Newsom's approval ratings, school reopenings, wearing masks, the wildfires, and then there's a low turnout possibility and enthusiasm among Democrats. And this is really the part of this article that is relevant. So Joshua Spivak, a senior fellow at the Hugh L. Carey Institute for Government Reform at Wagner College in New York City, said, moving the election of Gavin Newsom in the special election up to September was a huge mistake. Instead, Newsom and the governor's team could have taken advantage of extra time to mobilize supportive voters and increase fundraising efforts. Spivak, who studies recall elections, said mobilizing voters to participate is always a problem. The Berkeley poll found that 90% of Republicans expressed a high interest in recall voting, compared to 60% of Democrats who expressed similar interest. So again, podcast listeners, in California, 90% of Republicans have expressed a very high interest in casting their ballot in this recall election, and I'm sure it's against Newsom. And only 60% of Democrats have expressed a similar interest. And I would not be surprised, out of those Democrats who have expressed a similar interest, I suspect there's a significant amount of Democrats who want Newsom gone as well. And why wouldn't you want him gone? I mean, it just makes perfect sense. This guy has run this state into the ground. And look, there's also this issue too. Kamala Harris is coming to San Francisco. She's the vice president of the United States. She's going back home to her hometown to try to get out the vote for Gavin Newsom. And this is really, to me, as important as unelecting Newsom as the governor of California. It's this issue of the vice president of the United States going back home, but not willing to go to the border, not willing to address the issues that are occurring at the border, not willing to address the issues that are occurring in Afghanistan, at least not willing to do so publicly. And if you're not willing to do so publicly as vice president of the United States, then you're not willing to do anything. And yet it shows you that all Democrats care about is campaigning and winning. They don't care about how they govern. They don't care about how effectively they govern. They don't care about how much they run a state into the ground. Remember, in San Francisco, where Kamala Harris is from, they have a poop patrol. And the poop patrol isn't to clean dog poop off of sidewalks and off of park benches and off of park grounds. It's to clean off human feces from those areas because they have such a massive homeless problem and drug problem. And this is the person that we elected as vice president of the United States. And instead of dealing with all those issues back home before she became vice president, instead of dealing with the really important issues of the day, all of the crises that are occurring internationally and the economy in the United States, we have a vice president who's going to go home and she's going to campaign for the very progressive Gavin Newsom, because that's all she really cares about is winning elections. She could care less about trying to truly make things better, because if she did, she would actually engage the media and talk about her solutions. She doesn't have any solutions. She hasn't given any solutions, and she doesn't intend to do so. All she cares about is winning. And so this podcast is called Red Wave Rising. And speaking of Red Wave Rising, we have some great exchanges between the House Minority Leader, Kevin McCarthy, and, of course, the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. So in the Patriot Journal, Kevin McCarthy claims there's a 100-year storm coming. It's the GOP that's going to sweep the 2022 elections. Now, of course, we're in 2021 now, and it's still late August in 2021. But given how badly the Biden and Harris administration is governing, and the lack of governing, of course, is what we mostly see. They're not really doing anything. We believe that there's going to be a sweep in the Republican races across the country, not just at the national level, but also at the state legislative level. So here's what the Patriot Journal states. As 2021 races by the 2022 midterm elections loom larger on the horizon, Democrats are hoping they can maintain their stranglehold on the House and Senate, but the GOP has other ideas. Republicans have been touting a possible red wave for most of the year. They believe the stage is set for a major shift of power on Capitol Hill. During an interview with Fox News, House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy made his case for a Republican takeover in 2022, and he cited a variety of reasons why it could happen. He was speaking on the last day of the Gold Caucus Summit, a summer event in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. Typically, many wealthy GOP donors attend that event, and this often includes many top Republican officials. McCarthy said the red wave kicked into high gear when Democrat Representative Ron Kind of Wisconsin announced his retirement this week. So here's where we're going to really break this down. It's not just that there's a red wave coming in 2022 because of the incredible mismanagement of our economy by the Democrat Party, not just domestic affairs, but international affairs. It's also that there are many Democrats in Congress who are in the House of Representatives who are seeing this, and they are in swing districts or districts that could potentially be redistricted in a way that is not kind to them, and they are therefore deciding to not run for re-election. So one such district is in Wisconsin, and it's represented currently by Democratic Representative Ron Kind, K-I-N-D, and he's saying he's not going to run again. He's going to retire, and that makes 8 House Democrats who have announced they're leaving Congress either because of retirement or because they're trying to run for a statewide office where they feel like they would have a better chance of winning because they're likely not to win in their reelection bids in the House of Representatives or in the United States Senate. And so it represents a huge opportunity for the GOP. McCarthy is predicting more Democrat retirements, and he also spoke about a certain phenomenon. He says, pointing to history and redistricting, the House GOP leader emphasized that this cycle is like the 100-year storm. He also pointed to the current climate and argued that you look at the issue set of where the public is at crime, inflation, wokeism, the border, all of those the Democrats have to play defense upon. Republicans don't have to play defense at all. McCarthy also said Republicans have redistricting on their side, and this is going to be a lasting majority. And that's because, podcast listeners, that it is the state legislatures that, generally speaking, do the redistricting. In some states, it's not the state legislatures that have decided to continue to do the redistricting. They have given that authority over to independently appointed people from both parties that are supposedly nonpartisan. Nonetheless, it is constitutionally the state legislatures that are responsible for redistricting. And because the Republicans have worked so hard over the years to try to win more state legislatures than the Democrats and more state legislator seats than the Democrats, they have the upper hand. And there's a good reason for that, because in a state legislature, you are much closer to the people than you are as a United States congressman. Fine, a United States congressman represents a region, but a state legislator does as well. And as a general principle, the people they represent, it's a much smaller group of people, and they tend to be a bit more homogenous, unless, of course, that district was actually gerrymandered as well. So in the Daily Wire, a message loud and clear: GOP flips a Connecticut state Senate district. Biden won by 25 points. So this kind of underscores this red wave rising podcast. Again, in the Daily Wire, in Connecticut, there is a state Senate district. Biden won it by 25 points in the presidential election, and it just flipped because it was a special election. Republican Ryan Fazio beat Democrat Alexis Gavanter by nearly 3 points to secure a seat in the Connecticut Senate, flipping State Senate District 36 from blue to red in the state of Connecticut. Today, quote, the voters of Greenwich, Stamford, and New Canaan sent a message loud and clear to the state capitol in Connecticut that a change is going to come, Fazio told reporters on Tuesday night, according to the Greenwich Times. Quote, together we can reduce taxes and the cost of living and create economic opportunity for all. We can once again make our neighborhoods safe and support the local police. We can protect personal freedoms and local control, and we can bring people together to create a brighter future for all. So if you notice, he touched upon some of those key issues that Democrats are completely flubbing at the national and local level, which is economic opportunity, safe streets, supporting the police, and personal freedoms. Very, very interesting. And so what happened here is there's a special election that's in Connecticut, and Ryan Fazio won, took the seat back. And it's because there was a state senator that had flipped that seat blue during the presidential election, and she resigned because she is in a very bitter dispute with her husband. I think her name is Senator Alex Kasser. Kasser resigned in June, just basically a couple of months ago, because her divorce was getting really dirty. And it was getting dirty in part because Kasser, who has 3 children, and they all live at home still, so they're all, minors. She came out as gay and put her lover on her staff and paid her out of her pocket, which apparently you're not allowed to do in Connecticut. So she was paying her lover to work on her staff while she was married with 3 children, married to a guy, by the way, and came out, and then that all kind of backfired, as you can imagine. And so she resigned. So then there was a special election that just occurred, and she was replaced by a Republican who's now a state senator, and that is Mr. Fazio. So good for him. But that goes to the red wave rising, of course. And that brings us to some interesting clips, because there's this firestorm that is occurring between Nancy Pelosi and Kevin McCarthy. And we could probably play these kinds of clips all day long, because Nancy Pelosi is always quipping and saying something nasty about somebody. And let's be fair, McCarthy is perfectly capable of that as well. I have always seen McCarthy as kind of like this California guy who probably was a stoner when he was growing up, and then somehow found his way into Congress and somehow became the House Minority Leader. That's always the way I've seen him. I don't see him as a particularly deep thinker, but apparently he's a very good strategist. So we will see in 2022 if that is true. So Kevin McCarthy says he wants to investigate all of the stock trades made by Nancy Pelosi, where she made millions upon millions of dollars or saved millions of dollars, if the Republicans take over in 2022. So again, McCarthy said that if the Republicans take over in 2022, and really it's kind of a when they take over the United States House of Representatives, and then Kevin McCarthy would become the Speaker of the House, his first order of business, he said, is to investigate all of the really very, very suspect stock trades made by Nancy Pelosi and her husband while she was Speaker. So remember, if you're Speaker of the House of Representatives, you get to decide which bills pass. And so if you pass a bill that decides to regulate a tech industry, or to engage in a bill that is requiring data privacy, that could easily affect a lot of tech companies. And guess where those tech companies are largely located? In the San Francisco Bay Area, where Nancy Pelosi represents. So Nancy Pelosi's husband engages in regular stock trades, and has been for years, that just happens to trade stocks just at the right time. Just at the right time. And by at the right time, what do we mean? Means that he trades those stocks right before a bill passes in the United States Congress that might affect the company whose stock he might own. So in other words, he sells that stock. So he saves millions of dollars because that company's stock would potentially go down. So he's using this inside information that he has. And where is he getting it? Is he reading it from the Wall Street Journal? I don't think so. All he has to do is talk to his wife. It's pillow talk, right? They're in the same bed together. It's hard to believe that that would be the case with Nancy Pelosi, but they're in the same bed together, and I'm sure he's saying, "Hey, honey, I own this stock in Google, and my understanding is that Google stock might be affected because you might pass a data privacy law. Do you plan on passing that data privacy law where the individual gets to have and retain ownership of their data and opt out of any kind of collection or organizing or ownership of the data by anyone other than you? And that at that point, she's like, well, no, we don't plan on doing it. Okay, well, then I'm not going to sell the stock. I'm just going to keep the stock. And then the next day, there's a story that breaks in the Wall Street Journal. Nancy Pelosi comes out against the regulation of data. So therefore, the companies like Google can continue to operate the way they've been operating, in which case the stock goes up. And her husband and Nancy Pelosi do just fine. So Kevin McCarthy says that's the first thing he wants to do is to investigate all of this nonsense that has been occurring in that marriage with respect to stock trades. And so here is Deneen Borelli. She's a talking head on Fox News speaking about this particular issue. We have that clip, and here it is.
But House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy is now saying if the Republicans take back control of the House in the midterms, that they will prioritize investigating Democrat fraud and abuse, including suspicions of insider trading by House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's husband. The House Speaker is saying they are doing things within the letter of the law. They're also they would say that they were going to look into Hunter Biden, too. What do you say to all of this?
Well, first of all, I think the timing of Paul Pelosi's investments are questionable. We're talking something like $11 million in big tech stocks and call options just before the House was to vote on several bills aimed at reining in big tech. So this is a matter of ethics and a matter of accountability. So I think there should be investigations.
Of course there should be investigations, because this is exactly what upsets the American people from all parties, by the way. And I want to make sure that the podcast listeners understand where I'm coming from on this issue. I don't care if you are a Republican, an independent, or a Democrat. If you are profiting off of insider information as a result of your public office, and you are giving that information about policy changes, significant policy changes that might affect stocks, and you're telling your spouse or your significant other or your stock trader, then you need to go to jail. And the problem is that the American people, by and large, agree with this. They agree with what I just said, but there never seems to be any accountability on the Democrat side. It only seems to me that it's only Republicans who have a tendency of getting in trouble, as they should if they did something wrong. But this is the Speaker of the House, and everybody's afraid of her. Everybody's afraid. And I'm convinced, and here's some insight, podcast listeners, I'm convinced they're afraid of Nancy Pelosi because she'll sick big tech against you. She will. She'll sick Twitter against you, YouTube, Facebook, all of the big tech companies, and make sure that they ruin your reputation or basically deplatform you or whatever it takes to get rid of you. I'm convinced that she has that kind of power, and that's why no one wants to take her on. Well, McCarthy has taken her on. They're both from the same state, after all. And so we would go from a House majority leader who is from California to a House majority leader who's from California, but one's a Democrat, one's a Republican. Well, here's PBS reporting on the Kevin McCarthy comment that he wants to investigate Nancy Pelosi. PBS is reporting, and of course, PBS is a public station that exists only because we, the taxpayers, are paying for it. So it's basically state news. So Pelosi calls McCarthy a moron. We have that clip, and here it is.
In the day's other news, the CDC reported that 2/3 of all U.S. counties are now COVID-19 hotspots, where even the vaccinated should resume wearing masks indoors. In response, the Pentagon and the Department of Homeland Security ordered all employees to mask up. The U.S. House of Representatives did likewise. But Republican leader Kevin McCarthy sharply criticized the move, and Democratic Speaker Nancy Pelosi was overheard reacting, quote, "He's such a moron." The two party leaders kept up their war of words later at separate appearances.
Good morning. To say that wearing a mask is not based on science, I think is not wise, and that was my comment. And that's all I'm going to say about that.
This is just about more control. This is just the beginning of a set, because school's going to start coming back. They're going to shut school down again. This is about control.
So Pelosi never really addressed the whole stock trade issue. She just went right to the masks, because McCarthy did say, in addition to the stock trade stuff with Pelosi, that he thinks it's absurd that members who are vaccinated should still have to wear masks. Members of Congress, that is. He believes they should not have to wear masks because, after all, that's the whole point of a vaccination. If it really is a vaccination, then it should work. And that's why we call it a vaccination, in which case McCarthy's point is, why should those of us who are in the United States Congress who are vaccinated still wear masks? Well, in addition to that, he said that if he becomes the Speaker of the House, which he's likely to next year, that the first thing he's going to do is investigate Pelosi's stock trades. And of course, Pelosi came back and said, well, he's a moron. She called McCarthy a moron. And then in addition to that, she went right to the mask thing. She wouldn't even address the stock trades because she knows she's dirty. Everybody knows she's dirty in this particular respect. And this is a problem in America because when you have a whole class of citizens on both sides, right? Democrats and Republicans, blue collar Democrats, blue collar Republicans, who see their elected leaders, some of them, not all, some, getting very wealthy off of insider information, it causes them to lose confidence in our system of government. And there has to be equal prosecution. There has to be equal prosecution of Democrats and equal prosecution of Republicans. So next up, podcast listeners, we have the Daily Biden Dumpster Fire. That's right, the Daily Biden Dumpster Fire. So Joe Biden blows off questions about the Afghanis who were falling from the American plane. So you've seen this on TV, but you probably haven't heard the various clips that we're going to play. And as you know, there was this frantic scene. The scene is still playing out in Afghanistan, where thousands upon thousands of Afghanis came to the airport in Kabul. And as they were making their way to the airport, a lot of American planes were preparing to take off. Some were boarding and others were taking off and taxiing the runway to get to the point where they could take off. And so a number of Afghanis were trying to climb on the plane. And I presume their thought process was they could potentially find a gap somewhere to get into the plane, maybe through the cargo area, or maybe through where the wheels, you have the wheels where you taxi the plane, and that opening there, potentially maybe they thought they could go through there as well. I'm not sure, but nonetheless, this is how desperate the Afghanis were to leave. Kind of speaks for itself. When you are climbing on a plane and literally thinking you might be able to hold on or find your way in as the plane takes off, that's how badly you want to leave the country. Things must really be bad. So Zaki Anwari was part of the Afghan Youth Football League, in other words, soccer. He was only 19 years old and he fell to his death. And so George Stephanopoulos asked Joe Biden about this. But before we play that clip, we're going to play the clip about Zaki Anwari, who is the Afghan youth football player who's only 19 years old, who did just that. He climbed on the plane and was desperate to get out and ultimately fell to his death when the plane was airborne. And that's how badly he wanted to leave. And so we have a clip about this particular matter from BBC, and here it is.
One of the young men who fell from a plane, clinging to it even after takeoff, a talented footballer who had played for the national youth team, part of a generation of Afghans now facing a deeply uncertain future. Sikandar Kamani, BBC News, Kabul.
So pretty bad, right? You have all these Afghanis, and they showed a picture. If you're watching us on YouTube, they actually showed a picture on that BBC news clip of Zaki Anwari, a young man with his whole life ahead of him. Very sad, right? That's incredible because it shows us as Americans that there are people in Afghanistan who really do want to have a better life. And they realize and have come to the realization that because we are leaving, that better life no longer exists in Afghanistan. It's something that should be talked about at more depth by Vice President Harris and President Biden to really speak to American values and why this is happening. But of course, they're incapable of doing so. And who knows why? Who knows why? I mean, they apparently don't even have speechwriters around them that can do it, as we've spoken about before. But nonetheless, this daily Biden dumpster fire that we have is Joe Biden being asked by George Stephanopoulos about this very individual and others like him who fell to their deaths as they're climbing on the plane, desperately trying to get in, clinging to it as the plane takes off. That's how badly they want to leave. And listen to Joe Biden's response when George Stephanopoulos asks him about this. We have that clip, and here it is.
We've all seen the pictures. We've seen those hundreds of people packed into a C-17. We've seen Afghans falling.
That was 4 days ago, 5 days ago.
What did you think when you first saw those pictures?
What I thought was we have to gain control of this. We have to move this more quickly. We have to move in a way in which we can take control of that airport.
So that was 4 days ago, was Joe Biden's response to George Stephanopoulos. So ABC News correspondent, or ABC News anchor, George Stephanopoulos asked Joe Biden, you know, what are you going to do about this? You have people falling to their deaths from American planes because they so badly want to leave their country and come to a place that has freedom and have a better opportunity and a better life. And Joe Biden's response is, that was 4 days ago. Who says that? What kind of American president, what kind of a civilized society that has a so-called civilized president would say that was 4 days ago? Wouldn't you instead say something like, I'm really, really sorry this happened? Zaki Anwari, who was the 19-year-old youth football player in Afghanistan, should not have fallen to his death. We should have assured them that we would do everything that we could in an orderly fashion to get them out of Afghanistan if they really wanted to, but that we had to prioritize who was leaving first, which makes perfect sense, and that we were trying to take control of the situation, and this happened anyway, and we're so sorry for him, we're so sorry for his family. You know, that would be the normal thing a president would say, but again, in this daily dumpster fire, Biden is like, 4 days ago. I mean, a bunch of people climbed on a plane, and they fell, and they died, and they fell probably 1,000 feet, and, basically fell to their death, and it must have been a horrible thing. And, it's 4 days ago. Let's talk about what's happening today in Afghanistan, which apparently that's even going to be any better. So unbelievably so, George Stephanopoulos didn't even follow up. He didn't even say to Joe Biden, well, Mr. President, don't you think that you should show some compassion about this particular issue? No, of course not. Because George Stephanopoulos is a progressive. He's not going to try to undermine Joe Biden, who's, of course, has no credibility left anymore. So understanding all of this that played out, Donald Trump was speaking in Alabama just 2 days ago, his usual tour that he does. This is continuing, by the way, but it's not being covered by the media. Podcast listeners, you wouldn't even know this is happening, but it's still happening. And his crowds are huge still. So here's Trump speaking in Alabama 2 days ago about this particular issue. Here it is.
The scene of those big giant planes taking off with people hanging on the sides and falling off. There'll never be anything like that. That's worse than the helicopters. You remember the helicopters taking off the roofs? This blows it away. Not even a contest. This will go down as one of the great military defeats of all time, and it did not have to happen that way. This is not a withdrawal. This was a total surrender.
That's exactly right. And imagine the optics, right? These optics, people climbing on American planes, the plane takes off and they fall off and fall to their death. And of course, so many people see different things, right? I think Democrats see, we just need to get out of there. It's not our problem. And of course, I think there's so many others who say, this is a humanitarian issue. There are a lot of people that actually want a better life, like this 19-year-old. I mean, it's really at the beginning of his life, and probably really what he wanted to do is to play football, right? Which is soccer. He probably just wanted to go somewhere where he could actually play and have an opportunity to play professionally, which, of course, in Afghanistan, as you can imagine, there are incredibly limited opportunities because most of your life is spent just trying to survive. So in the Wall Street Journal today, a firefight erupts at Kabul airport as security situation worsens in Afghanistan. This is today, right? One Afghanistan soldier is killed at the airport as tens of thousands are still seeking to flee the country. Tens of thousands of people in Afghanistan are trying to flee the country. Imagine that, tens of thousands. A gun battle broke out early today. This is today. At Kabul's airport, killing at least one Afghan soldier, with the security situation getting even worse as the United States and its Western allies consider extending an evacuation operation that has been engulfed in chaos for more than a week. Afghan, American, and German soldiers were involved in an exchange of fire early Monday that left one Afghan soldier dead and 3 more wounded, German military officials said. No injuries to American or German soldiers were reported. And the article just goes on to explain the chaos that is continuing there. Continuing. And if you were wondering what I think or what others think about Afghanistan, I've said before, and I just want to clarify what I said before. I think it was 2 podcasts ago. I said, we were there for 10 years. What I meant was we were there for 10 years too long. We were in Afghanistan for 20 years. We all know that. That's obvious. But we were there 10 years too long because it was actually 10 years ago in 2011 when we killed Osama bin Laden, who was in Pakistan, by the way, but much of the intelligence was gathered through operations in both Pakistan and in Afghanistan. But the mission to take Osama bin Laden out was launched from, of course, I believe, Afghanistan. And so that's when we should have left. And so on Fox News just recently, I think it was yesterday, Adam Bowler discusses his past negotiations with the Taliban. And I want to bring this up to you podcast listeners because Adam Bowler is a U.S. negotiator who has previously negotiated with the Taliban over the years, right? We've been there for 20 years. He's relatively young. So my guess is his negotiations have been relatively, recent, like the last 5 to 7 years. And so here's who Adam Bowler is. He's an American businessman and a government official who served as the first CEO of the United States International Development Finance Corporation. He was nominated by President Donald Trump and served until January 20th of 2021. He previously served in the Trump administration as the director of the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation, as well as the senior advisor for value-based transformation for health and Human Services Secretary under Human Services Secretary Alex Azar. So this gentleman was under the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation and others, I believe, negotiating with the Taliban, as in directly across a table. So you've got a conference room kind of thing. The Taliban's on one side and Adam Bowler's on the other side. And he talks about who he's really negotiating with and what is happening during the negotiations. And this alone, podcast listeners, should convince you as to why the Trump administration wanted to get out of Afghanistan and why we should have gotten out in 2011 after we killed Osama bin Laden. We have that clip from Adam Bowler in his own words, and here it is.
I would say that in terms of negotiating or discussions with the Taliban, I'd say on one side, they are a disciplined group that's regimented, and you can have discussions. The other side, it's a very tribal organization. During some of the discussions, one of the guys that had a larger beard was, I don't know if he was sniffing or eating his beard during the time. There was another guy that, was picking his nose during and put his hand like that. You can pretty much tell when someone's picking their nose, even if they do that. So keep in mind, it's a militant group, but it's a tribal group. And in this region, tribal groups respond to diplomacy when there's a strong hand too.
So this is Adam Bowler talking about the Taliban, and he was negotiating with them across the table, like in a conference room setting. And as he's negotiating with them, and this is, these are serious negotiations, one of the tribal leaders put his hand in front of his face like this and was picking his nose and eating it, but trying to hide it, like during a negotiation. And then the other one was taking his Taliban beard, like that real long beard, and pulling it up and then chewing on it like this, like he's chewing on a cigar, except that was his beard, while Adam Bowler was negotiating with the Taliban. And these are the same individuals who, there was a report recently, and by the way, we should have been told this 20 years ago, or at least 10 years ago, about how backward this country is. And here's another example. When asked during this evacuation process, how many people are in your family, many of the individuals in Afghanistan, they can't tell you how many people are in their family because they can't count. They can't even count with their fingers because they don't even know what it is. So what they do is they give the names of the people of their family. And then you have to count the names. Because can you imagine podcasts? I mean, it's just crazy. So here's a negotiator. I mean, if this same negotiator weren't so young, Adam Bowler, and he maybe was around in 2011 after we killed Osama bin Laden, said, well, my last negotiations, they were all picking their nose and eating their boogers, and they were chewing their beards. I think it might be time to leave now that we've killed Osama bin Laden. Just saying, it might be that time. So next up, podcast listeners, we have the dumbest bill in America. And do we have a lead up, Mr. Producer? Of course. Here it is. And it's the dumbest bill in America. And it is Mississippi. The state of Mississippi says you must isolate after testing COVID positive or go to prison for 5 years. I got to say that again. In Mississippi, if you're testing COVID positive, you must isolate or go to prison for 5 years. That is a true story. So, in Fox News, published 1 day ago, Mississippi orders coronavirus-infected individuals to isolate at home or face up to 5 years in prison. The Mississippi State Department of Health issued an alert on Friday ordering any coronavirus-positive individuals to isolate for at least 10 days or face up to a 5-year prison sentence and a fine up to $5,000. The isolation order comes amid surging COVID-19 cases in Mississippi as the 7-day average for new cases in the state reached 4,316 on Friday, nearly doubling the highest point during the second wave in January, according to Johns Hopkins University. Friday's order, issued by State Health Officer Dr. Thomas Dobbs, says that anyone infected with COVID-19 must remain in the home or other appropriate residential location for 10 days from the onset of illness. I wonder if they're going to send them to nursing homes. Failure to obey the isolation order could result in a fine of $500 or imprisonment of 6 months. However, since COVID-19 is a life-threatening disease, the potential punishments could be $5,000 or 5 years in prison or both, Dr. Dobbs wrote Friday. Can you imagine? Can you imagine any state Department of Health having that level of power? I mean, who has that kind of power? So not just in Fox News, but also in Daily Wire, Mississippi says to isolate after testing positive for COVID-19 or face 5 years in prison and a fine. And it says the same thing here. As COVID-19 cases rise in Mississippi, the state's Department of Health on Friday sent out that same alert. Stay at home or go to prison. So we actually have the order. And so not just relying on the news, we're actually going to read the State Department of Health's order in Mississippi. First of all, I have a problem with that word, order. You know, you must listen to our order. So COVID-19 isolation order. Can you imagine? I mean, who has that power? It's an isolation order. It's not a suggestion. It's not an alert. It's not an advisory. It's an order pursuant to Mississippi Code, et cetera, and the state of emergency declaration by the governor of state of Mississippi related to the coronavirus COVID-19 issued on March 14th, 2020. And by the way, this order is dated August 20th, 2021, but they're referencing the previous order that gives them this kind of power. Get this. The failure or refusal to obey the lawful order to stay home for at least 10 days and to listen to a health officer, it at a minimum or is a misdemeanor punishable by a fine of $500. It's a misdemeanor. You're going to have a record. Or imprisonment for 6 months or both. If a life-threatening disease is involved, failure or refusal to obey the lawful order of a health officer is a felony, punishable by a fine up to $5,000 or imprisonment up to 5 years or both. This is in the actual order from the Mississippi State Department of Health, podcast listeners. And I have to add to this order comes at a time when we have thousands of people crossing the border with COVID who are being distributed across the country in small towns, in cities, in the countryside, all across the country. These people have COVID. Do you think they're going to follow the order? Is it possible that the Biden administration located a few thousand migrants through a few thousand illegal immigrants in Mississippi? And that is the reason why the state of Mississippi has testing that is, through the roof for COVID. And of course, they don't talk about people dying in Mississippi. I'm not reading that. I don't have that information, to be fair. They're just saying testing positive. Okay. If you test positive, but you feel perfectly fine, you still got to stay home. You can't do anything else. Or they're going to send you to prison. And that's the other point I wanted to bring up is if we send you to prison, aren't you going to infect all the people in the prison? Kind of like Cuomo did by sending people to the nursing homes, which of course isn't funny because he killed 15,000 people. But we have migrants, illegal immigrants coming across the border. They're being relocated with COVID. They've already broken the law by crossing the border. But if you're an American citizen and you live in Mississippi, you're going to go to prison because you didn't stay home for 10 days because you knowingly had tested positive for COVID-19. And I just have to revisit the fact that we're giving this power to state departments of health across the country, such as Mississippi, which, by the way, podcast listeners, is a red state. I could care less if it's a red state and if it's run by Republicans. I could care less because if they're doing this, it's still wrong, whether it's a blue state or a red state. It's a stupid thing to do. And to call it an order, I mean, who do these people think? Imagine the next order that's going to come. You know what that order is? I want the State Department of Health to send out all of the doctors and nurses along with the police, and they're going to go door to door, and they're going to vaccinate you on the spot. And if you don't obey, the police will hold you down while you get vaccinated. Now, to be fair, what I just said is not part of the order, but why couldn't it be a future order? Who would have thought we would have been here by now? Who would have thought for 1 minute that a state could issue an order saying you're going to go to prison because you're not staying at home? Who would have thought that? While at the same time, you got the optics of the people crossing the border with COVID. It's absurd. It's idiotic. So why wouldn't they? Why wouldn't our government, who has been given these extraordinary powers in each state legislature, at least initially, some of those powers have expired, to be fair, but apparently not in Mississippi. And they've given the health officers these extraordinary powers. Why wouldn't a health officer come to your door and say, you're high risk for COVID-19 because of what you do for a living, and you have to get this vaccine, and you're going to have to get it now. And I have Officer Smith right here next to me, and Officer Smith is going to hold you down if you don't listen to what I say. You must obey. It is an order. Anytime something like this happens, it just makes me even more skeptical. I got to tell you, don't be mad at me, podcast listeners, but it makes me even more skeptical of a vaccine that apparently you're being forced in some cases to take in order to be able to keep your job, or you have to stay home. And then there's the other issue too, which is if you did get vaccinated, you still have to wear a mask. Obviously there's something wrong and our government isn't properly communicating it to us. And until they do so, I'm going to keep my level of skepticism incredibly high, as we should. And that is the dumbest bill in America. And that is it from Mark and the Millennials. Thank you for joining Mark and the Millennials. This is Mark Fisher. Thank you to our producer, Christopher Hopkins. Check us out on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Parler, Rumble, and our website. See you next time.